The babysitter. Emily's fingers tightened around the phone as the parents' voices grew more urgent. There's an escaped convict from the nearby prison. He's dangerous, and the police are warning everyone to stay inside and lock all doors and windows. Emily, we need you to check on the kids again and make sure everything's secure. The line went quiet for a second before the father's voice came through, tinged with panic. Don't open the door for anyone, no matter what. Emily reassured them once more, though the words barely left her lips as a cold dread settled over her. She glanced toward the staircase, where she could hear the faint sounds of her charges shifting in their sleep. But then, she heard something else, a faint shuffling noise coming from upstairs. She froze. It wasn't the kids. They were sound asleep. Her heart raced as the sounds grew louder, echoing down the empty hallway. Someone was moving around the upstairs. Someone who definitely wasn't supposed to be there. She locked the phone and tiptoed up the stairs, her breath catching in her throat. She called out softly, "Hello? Is everything okay?" But there was no response, just the sound of footsteps. With each step, the noise grew louder, almost like someone was walking closer to her. Panicked, she called the parents again, her voice trembling. "There's someone in the house. What do I do?" There was a long silence on the line, and then the father's voice came through, shaking but clear. "Get out of the house. Now. Don't wait." As she turned to run, Emily's heart skipped a beat. She saw the shadow of a man in the hallway, moving toward her. The figure was tall, thin, and dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured in the darkness. Her legs refused to move as terror gripped her, but something inside her snapped, and she bolted. She ran down the stairs, out the back door, and into the woods behind the house, not daring to look back until she heard the unmistakable sound of sirens approaching. The police arrived shortly after. They scoured the house and found the man hiding in the attic, just inches away from where Emily had been. The man was arrested, but when the police examined the attic more closely, they found something chilling, a collection of old, faded photographs of past babysitters who had worked in the house, many of them missing. Emily had been lucky, but the house had a sinister history, one that had claimed many others before her. The Whispering Shadows. Late one night, Tim, a college student, decided to stay up studying in his apartment, which was located in an old building on the edge of town. His roommates had gone out for the evening, leaving him alone in the dim, quiet space. As the hours passed and the clock neared midnight, Tim began to feel a strange unease, though he couldn't explain why. It wasn't the darkness or the silence, it was something else, something unshakable. He shrugged it off, thinking he was just tired, but as he got up to stretch, he heard a whisper. It was soft at first, so faint that he thought it might have been the wind, but as it repeated, it became clearer. "Tim. Tim." He froze. The voice was coming from the corner of the room, from the shadows in the farthest corner of the apartment. His heart raced as he slowly turned toward the corner, but there was nothing there. Just the ordinary mess of his cluttered room. He laughed nervously, trying to convince himself it was just his imagination. But then the whispers came again, this time closer. "Tim. Tim." This time, Tim felt a chill run down his spine. The voice was right behind him. He whipped around, but there was still nothing there, nothing except for the shadows, which seemed darker than before, shifting as if alive. Suddenly, he felt the cold breath on his neck, and the whisper came again, louder now, "Turn around." Terrified, Tim spun around, his eyes wide, and to his horror, he saw a figure standing in the doorway. A tall, thin figure with no face, just shadows swirling like smoke. He stumbled back, crashing into his desk, and in the moment of chaos, the figure lunged at him. In the frantic struggle, Tim lost his footing and collapsed onto the floor, his vision blurring. For a second, he thought he saw the shadowy figure whispering into his ear before everything went dark. When his roommates returned, they found him unconscious on the floor, clutching his textbooks. But the scariest part was the scratches on his neck, thin, deep marks, as if something had clawed at him from the shadows. Tim later moved out of the apartment, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something from that dark corner had followed him. Late at night, when he would lay in bed, he would still hear the whispers, calling his name. The Watcher. One winter night, Lisa and her husband, Mark, moved into a new home on the outskirts of town. The house, a charming two-story, was old but cozy, and they quickly settled in, eager to start their new life. However, soon after they moved in, Lisa began to notice something strange. Every evening, as the sun began to set, she would catch a glimpse of someone standing outside their window. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, but after it happened several times, she couldn't ignore it anymore. The person was always standing in the same spot, just out of view, hidden behind the large oak tree in their front yard. Mark dismissed her concerns, thinking it was simply a neighbor passing by or someone taking a walk. But Lisa wasn't convinced. The figure never moved, never even seemed to blink. It was as if it was just watching. One evening, unable to stand it any longer, Lisa decided to confront the figure. She grabbed a flashlight and, heart pounding, opened the front door to step outside. The air was frigid, and the yard was covered in snow, but as she approached the tree, her flashlight illuminated something that made her blood run cold. There, standing perfectly still in the snow, was a figure. But it wasn't just any figure, it was a man, his face pale and expressionless, with his eyes wide open and fixed on the house. Lisa screamed, stumbling back as she realized the man wasn't just standing there, he was staring at her through the window. She rushed back inside and locked the door. Her husband, now worried, checked the front yard but found no sign of anyone. He laughed nervously, telling Lisa it was probably just a homeless person passing through. But Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching them from outside. That night, as they slept, Lisa awoke to the sound of tapping on the window. Slowly, she turned her head, her breath catching in her throat as she saw the man's face, pressed against the glass, his eyes unblinking. The next morning, the police found nothing, and Lisa and Mark moved away shortly after. But the images of that cold, staring face stayed with Lisa for years, haunting her dreams. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the man's unblinking gaze. The last train. Samantha had always been a night owl, enjoying the quiet of the late hours. One evening, she missed the last bus home after a late meeting, so she opted to take the last train. The train station was nearly empty, with only a few others waiting. She stood alone on the platform, the cold air nipping at her skin. The sound of distant train wheels echoed through the tunnels, and a sense of loneliness hung in the air. As the train finally pulled in, she noticed something strange. The conductor, an older man with a gaunt face, gave her a strange look as she boarded. She waved it off, attributing it to tiredness. The train doors closed, and she took a seat by the window, staring out at the darkening city. As the train sped through the night, Samantha began to feel uneasy. The ride was silent except for the faint hum of the train and the rhythmic clattering of the wheels against the track. But then, around the third stop, she realized something strange. All the other passengers had disappeared. She was the only one left on the train. Her heart began to race. She walked down the aisle to check the other cars, but no one was there. Panicked, she returned to her seat, hoping it was some strange coincidence. The train continued to travel through the darkened countryside, the landscape outside growing increasingly desolate. The lights flickered once, then twice. Suddenly, the conductor appeared in the doorway of her car. He stared at her for a long moment, and then he spoke in a low, raspy voice. "You shouldn't have gotten on this train." Terrified, Samantha jumped to her feet and ran to the doors, desperately trying to open them. But they were locked. The train continued to speed down the tracks, now moving faster than before. The conductor's words echoed in her mind as she felt an icy chill spreading through her body. She pressed her face against the glass, looking for any sign of life outside. But the world beyond the train had become a blur of nothingness. As the train sped through the dark, Samantha felt her vision start to fade, and everything went black. The next morning, the police found the train at the station, completely empty, with no sign of the passengers. But Samantha's body was never found. The only trace left was a message on the train's walls: "The last stop is your final one." The stranger at the window. It had been a long week for Rachel. She was exhausted after moving into her new apartment, but she finally found time to relax on a Saturday night. The apartment was quiet, peaceful, and she had just made a cup of tea when she noticed something strange: a figure standing outside her window. The window was on the second floor of the building, so at first, she assumed it was a neighbor. But as she looked closer, she realized that the person was staring directly at her, unmoving. Rachel shivered. The person was tall, wearing a long coat, and their face was obscured by the dark, but their presence was unsettling. She quickly closed the curtains, dismissing it as nothing more than a coincidence. The next evening, Rachel came home late from work and went straight to her bedroom to unwind. But as she entered, she froze. There was the figure again, standing outside her window, staring in. This time, the figure didn't move at all. It wasn't just a vague silhouette, it was as if the person was waiting for her to notice. The same cold fear crept over Rachel, and she quickly pulled the curtains shut, her hands trembling. The following night, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She double-checked the locks on all her doors and windows. As she sat down on her couch, she turned on the TV, but then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. The figure was back. This time, it was even closer to the window, standing just inches away from the glass. It seemed to be pressing its face against the window, staring inside with hollow eyes. Rachel's pulse quickened as her heart raced. She backed away slowly, terrified to look away, but when she turned to reach for her phone, the figure was gone. Terrified, Rachel called the police. They arrived quickly, but found no sign of anyone outside her apartment. They assured her that she was probably just seeing things, but the next day, Rachel decided to take matters into her own hands. She spent the day trying to gather information about the building, speaking with neighbors and checking historical records. That's when she found something chilling. The building was once the site of a tragic murder. Several years ago, a tenant had been found dead in their apartment, but there were no clues to who might have killed them. The only strange detail was that witnesses had claimed to see a shadowy figure staring from the window the night before the murder took place. Rachel's blood ran cold as she realized the horrifying truth. The person she had seen wasn't just someone in her building, it was a ghost, trapped forever, staring through her window. The reflection. Carla had never been afraid of mirrors. She'd always loved the way they made her feel connected to her surroundings, reflecting everything back to her in perfect symmetry. But ever since she'd moved into her new apartment, things had started to change. At night, when the lights were low, she began to notice something off about the mirrors in her home. It wasn't that they were cracked or damaged, but whenever she looked into one, she felt like someone, or something, was watching her. The first time it happened, she thought she was just tired. But then it kept happening. Every time she stood in front of a mirror, her reflection seemed just slightly out of sync with her movements. At first, she dismissed it as exhaustion, or maybe even the way the light hit the glass. But one evening, after coming home late from work, she walked into her bedroom to find her reflection staring back at her with a wicked grin, even though her own face remained neutral. Frozen, Carla couldn't tear her eyes away. The reflection in the mirror started to mimic her, but its expressions were twisted, its mouth pulling into a cruel smile that Carla hadn't made. She stepped back, horrified, but the reflection stepped forward. The more she backed away, the more it advanced, until it was standing on the other side of the glass, mirroring her every movement. Panicked, Carla turned and fled from the room, but every time she passed a mirror in the hallway, her reflection followed, its smile widening as it seemed to become more than just a reflection. The next day, she moved out, but she couldn't escape it. No matter where she went, there was always the reflection of that grin, always waiting. The hitchhiker. It was late at night, and Tom had just finished a long shift at work. Tired, he drove home through the empty highway, the only sound being hum of his car's engine. The road was isolated, the darkness enveloping everything outside his headlights. As he passed a lonely stretch of road, he saw a figure standing by the side, a woman with a suitcase, looking like she was waiting for a ride. Feeling sympathetic, Tom pulled over. The woman approached the car and asked if he could take her to the next town over. She seemed tired and desperate, and he could hear the sadness in her voice. He agreed, and she climbed into the passenger seat, her suitcase resting in her lap. As they drove, they talked casually, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The woman never said much about herself, and her answers to his questions were vague, almost rehearsed. When they reached the next town, Tom pulled up near a gas station. The woman looked at him with wide, grateful eyes, then grabbed her suitcase and stepped out of the car. As she walked away, Tom's curiosity got the best of him. He rolled down his window and called after her, "Are you okay? Where are you going?" The woman paused, turned, and smiled softly, but there was something unsettling about her gaze. "I've been waiting for this ride for a long time," she said cryptically, before turning and disappearing into the night. The next morning, Tom passed through the same stretch of road. He was horrified to see a newspaper headline, "Woman found dead on highway, police investigating unsolved murder." The woman he had picked up the night before was the victim in the story, and she had been dead for years. The footsteps. Megan had just moved into an old apartment in a historic building, and while it had a certain charm, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The first few nights were quiet, but soon she began hearing soft footsteps in the hallways, slow, deliberate steps, as though someone was walking back and forth, late at night. She would wake up to the sound, heart racing, only to find the hall empty when she opened her door. Thinking it was a neighbor, she dismissed it, until the footsteps started happening at random times during the day, too. Sometimes they were light, like a soft tapping, other times heavy, like boots dragging on the floor. One evening, after hearing the footsteps yet again, Megan decided to follow the noise, convinced it was coming from the floor above her. She climbed the stairs cautiously, each step creaking under her weight. But when she reached the top floor, there was no one there, just empty apartments, darkened and quiet. The footsteps stopped. Confused, Megan turned back to leave but froze at the sight of something chilling, a shadowy figure standing at the far end of the hallway. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat as the footsteps began again, but this time, they were right behind her. She turned and ran down the stairs, but as she did, the footsteps followed, getting closer and closer with each step. When she reached the ground floor, the building's front door was locked. She tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. When she turned around, the hallway was empty again. The footsteps had stopped. The next morning, the landlord informed her that the building had been the site of a tragedy. A fire had broken out on the top floor years ago, and many people had died. Megan moved out shortly after, but every so often, she would hear those footsteps in her dreams, always following her wherever she went. The Haunted Doll. Lena was thrilled to find the antique doll at the flea market. It was a beautiful porcelain figure with delicate features, dressed in a faded lace gown. The vendor had told her it was a rare find, claiming that it had been passed down through generations. The price was a bit steep, but Lena didn't mind. It was perfect for her collection. That night, after placing the doll on a shelf in her bedroom, Lena went to bed, not thinking much of it. But as she lay there in the dark, she felt a strange chill in the air. The room was silent, except for the soft creak of the house settling. Suddenly, she heard a faint scratching noise, as though something was moving across the floor. She sat up, her heart pounding. At first, she thought it was a rat or something else, but then she noticed that the scratching was coming from the shelf, right where the doll sat. Curious but uneasy, Lena got up to investigate. As she approached the shelf, she gasped. The doll wasn't where she had left it. It had moved slightly to the edge of the shelf, as though it had been inching toward her. Shaking, she placed the doll back in its original position and returned to bed. But that night, the scratching continued, louder now, almost like nails scraping against wood. Lena's eyes shot open, and she froze. There, standing at the foot of her bed, was the doll. It wasn't sitting innocently anymore. It was standing upright, its glassy eyes staring directly at her, its lips twisted into a grin. Lena screamed and threw the doll across the room, but it landed gently on the floor, as though nothing had happened. From that moment on, she could never escape the sensation of being watched. Each night, the doll would appear in a different position, closer and closer to her bed. No matter how many times she moved it, it always came back. Eventually, Lena moved out of the house and gave the doll away. But the doll was never far from her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter where she went, the doll was still watching her from somewhere in the dark. The house on the hill. It had always been an eerie house, standing alone at the top of the hill, its windows darkened by years of neglect. No one had ever lived in it for long, and people in town often spoke of strange noises coming from inside at night. But when Adam moved into the town, he didn't believe in local ghost stories. He was a man of logic and reason. One evening, as he walked home from the store, he decided to take a shortcut by the old house. The sun was setting, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the overgrown lawn. As he passed the house, he heard a faint sound, something like the creaking of wood, followed by a low, eerie whisper. The door to the house was ajar, and though he hesitated, something compelled him to step closer. Pushing the door open, Adam stepped into the entryway. The house smelled musty, like it hadn't been inhabited for decades. He explored the rooms, each one filled with broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, and a thick layer of dust. But then, in the back of the house, he came across something strange, a door leading down into a basement. It was cracked open, and a cold draft seeped out. Curiosity got the better of him, and he descended into the basement. The stairs creaked under his weight, and as he reached the bottom, the air felt heavier, as if something was pressing down on him. In the dim light, he could just make out an old wooden chest in the corner of the room. It was covered in dust, but there was something oddly compelling about it. As Adam approached the chest, he heard the faintest whisper again. This time, it was clearer, "Get out before it's too late." Ignoring the warning, he opened the chest. Inside was a collection of old, tattered books, their pages yellowed with age. But as he flipped through the pages, something caught his eye, a photograph of the house, with a family standing in front of it. The family was smiling, but in the background, something dark loomed, an enormous shadow, reaching out from the house like a monstrous hand. Suddenly, Adam felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He whipped around, but no one was there. The air in the basement turned frigid, and the shadows seemed to close in around him. Panic surged through him as he ran back up the stairs, but when he reached the door, it slammed shut. Trapped in the dark, Adam could hear the whispers growing louder, more frantic. Just as he thought he couldn't breathe anymore, the door flew open, and he bolted outside, gasping for air. As he looked back at the house, he saw a figure in one of the upstairs windows, staring at him with empty, soulless eyes. He never went back to that house again, and soon after, the entire town seemed to avoid it. No one knows what Adam saw that night, but the house still stands, waiting for the next curious soul to wander too close. The Mirror Secret. Jessica had always loved antique stores, and when she stumbled upon an old, ornate mirror at a second-hand shop, she couldn't resist buying it. The frame was beautiful, carved with intricate designs of vines and flowers, and the glass had a cloudy, vintage look to it. She set it in her living room, admiring how it seemed to add a touch of elegance to the space. But after a few days, she began to notice something strange. When she would look into the mirror, she would see not only her own reflection but a shadowy figure standing behind her. The figure was always the same, a tall man with a dark, featureless face, wearing an old-fashioned suit. Each time, the figure would stand just behind her, as if watching her. She assumed it was just her imagination, but it began to happen more frequently. The figure was always in the same spot, never moving, always still. One night, Jessica decided to confront whatever it was. She stood in front of the mirror for several minutes, willing herself to see something else, but the figure remained there. With a deep breath, she called out to the figure in the mirror. "Who are you?" The reflection in the mirror didn't answer, but Jessica saw the figure's head tilt, as if it were listening. Then, without warning, the figure's hand shot out from the mirror, grabbing her wrist with a cold, unrelenting grip. Jessica screamed and yanked her arm back, but the figure didn't let go. It dragged her toward the mirror, and as she struggled, the glass began to ripple like water. She kicked and clawed at the frame, but the mirror seemed to pull her closer and closer. When her friends arrived the next day, they found the mirror on the floor, cracked, with Jessica's reflection trapped inside, her face pressed against the glass, eyes wide with terror. The mirror was now empty, but her image remained within, eternally reaching out, begging to be freed. The tapping. Lindsay had always been an avid fan of horror stories, but she never truly believed in the supernatural. That all changed one late evening when she moved into her new apartment. It was a charming, older building with creaky floors and drafty windows, but she loved it. It felt like home, until the tapping started. It began innocently enough, a soft tap-tap, almost like someone knocking on her door. But when she opened it, no one was there. The first few times, she thought it was just the building settling, or maybe it was her imagination. But as the days went by, the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't just at the door anymore, it was coming from all around her. It was as though someone was tapping on the walls, the ceiling, even the floors beneath her feet. One night, unable to sleep from the persistent noise, Lindsay decided to investigate. She walked through every room, tapping the walls and listening closely. But the taps were always in response to her own. They were rhythmic, methodical, there was something deliberate about them. As she stood still in the living room, the tapping grew louder, almost as if it was getting closer. Suddenly, she heard a whisper, cold and faint, "Let me in." Frozen, Lindsay turned around. There, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, was a figure. It was a dark silhouette, but she could make out a face, pale, hollow, with eyes that seemed to glimmer with malevolence. The tapping stopped. The figure smiled, revealing a mouth full of sharp, crooked teeth. "I've been waiting," it hissed. Lindsay ran, her heart pounding, but the figure followed her. No matter where she went, it was always there, just beyond the corners of her vision. She didn't stop running until she reached the front door, only to find it locked. She turned back to look, and the figure was gone, but the tapping, that awful tapping, continued. Lindsay moved out a week later, but she never forgot the eerie sound that haunted her every step. The Babysitter's Call. Samantha was a college student trying to make some extra cash. When she saw a babysitting ad online, she eagerly applied. The family seemed nice, and they lived in a quiet neighborhood at the edge of town. They had one young child, a boy named Timmy, and everything seemed normal when she arrived at the house. The parents gave her clear instructions, then left for the night, leaving Samantha alone with the child. Timmy was a sweet boy, but he had a peculiar habit. He would always insist that the man was watching him. Samantha thought it was just an overactive imagination, until the night took a dark turn. As the evening wore on, she sat in the living room, scrolling through her phone while Timmy played in the next room. Suddenly, she heard a soft voice, Timmy's voice, calling from the hallway, "Can I have some water, please?" Samantha got up, walked into the hallway, but found the room empty. She called out to Timmy, but there was no response. Confused, she went upstairs to check on him. The door to his room was ajar, but when she pushed it open, Timmy wasn't there either. Heart pounding, she dialed the parents' number, her voice shaky. "Hi, it's Samantha. Timmy is missing." Before the parents could respond, Samantha heard the unmistakable sound of a child giggling. She turned, and there was Timmy, standing in the corner of the hallway, grinning widely. "Who were you talking to, Timmy?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "The man," Timmy said, his voice low and unsettling. "He says he's going to come home soon." Samantha's blood ran cold. She turned back to the phone, only to hear the parent's voice, too calm. "Samantha, "We never hired a babysitter." The call ended abruptly. Samantha screamed and grabbed Timmy, running toward the front door. As she stepped outside, she turned to look at the house one last time. A figure was standing in the upstairs window, watching her with dark eyes. She never worked as a babysitter again. The Forgotten Room. Elliot had always been fond of old houses. When he inherited his great-grandfather's mansion, he was excited to move in, even though it had been vacant for many years. It was a sprawling place with countless rooms, staircases, and long, empty hallways. The house had always felt cold, but Elliot chalked it up to its age. One afternoon, while exploring the second floor, Elliot discovered a door hidden behind a faded tapestry. It was strange. He was certain he had checked every room in the house, yet this door seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. Intrigued, he turned the knob and stepped inside. The room was small, with no windows. The walls were lined with dusty bookshelves, but the strangest thing was the painting on the far wall. It depicted a dark figure standing on a cliff, staring out over a stormy sea. There was something unsettling about the eyes, they seemed to follow him. When Elliot approached the painting to get a better look, he heard a soft, whispering voice from behind him. "Leave now," it said, barely audible. He spun around, but the room was empty. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. He tried to open it, but the knob wouldn't budge. Panicking, Elliot turned back to the room. That's when he saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the corner, half concealed in darkness. The figure slowly approached him, its movements jerky and unnatural. Elliot backed into the wall, his breath shallow. "Who are you?" The figure's lips parted in a grin. "I've been waiting for someone to find the room." A loud bang shook the door, and it swung open. Elliot bolted, never looking back. When he told his family about the room, they insisted there had never been a door there. No one had ever seen that painting. And when they searched the house, the room was gone. But Elliot swears he will never forget the shadow that waited in that forgotten room. The Midnight Caller. When Mark bought his new phone, he didn't think much of it. It was a simple upgrade from his old device, and everything seemed normal, until he started receiving calls at midnight. At first, they were random numbers, people he didn't know. The calls were silent, as if no one was there, but then he started hearing soft breathing on the other end. He tried blocking the numbers, but the calls kept coming. One night, the phone rang again at midnight. This time, Mark picked up, demanding to know who was calling. "I'm watching you," a deep, raspy voice said. "I know where you are." Mark felt a chill run through him. He hung up quickly, but the calls didn't stop. They came every night, always at midnight, always with that same eerie warning. The next night, Mark decided to confront the caller. He stayed awake, staring at his phone, waiting. When the call came, he answered it immediately. But this time, the voice on the other end didn't say a word. Instead, a low, distorted laugh filled the phone. Mark's eyes widened as he realized that the voice was coming from the room behind him. He turned around slowly. Standing in the doorway was a tall, shadowy figure, watching him with glowing eyes. The phone fell from his hand as the figure stepped forward. The reflection. Carla had never been afraid of mirrors. She'd always loved the way they made her feel connected to her surroundings, reflecting everything back to her in perfect symmetry. But ever since she'd moved into her new apartment, things had started to change. At night, when the lights were low, she began to notice something off about the mirrors in her home. It wasn't that they were cracked or damaged, but whenever she looked into one, she felt like someone, or something, was watching her. The first time it happened, she thought she was just tired. But then it kept happening. Every time she stood in front of a mirror, her reflection seemed just slightly out of sync with her movements. At first, she dismissed it as exhaustion, or maybe even the way the light hit the glass. But one evening, after coming home late from work, she walked into her bedroom to find her reflection staring back at her with a wicked grin, even though her own face remained neutral. Frozen, Carla couldn't tear her eyes away. The reflection in the mirror started to mimic her, but its expressions were twisted, its mouth pulling into a cruel smile that Carla hadn't made. She stepped back, horrified, but the reflection stepped forward. The more she backed away, the more it advanced, until it was standing on the other side of the glass, mirroring her every movement. Panicked, Carla turned and fled from the room, but every time she passed a mirror in the hallway, her reflection followed, its smile widening as it seemed to become more than just a reflection. The next day, she moved out, but she couldn't escape it. No matter where she went, there was always the reflection of that grin, always waiting.